Welcome to this next episode of the Sparks podcast. In this episode, I'm talking to Lisa Lloyd about the subject of imposter syndrome. I know you're going to find it interesting. We talk about a number of different things, the things that stop us from becoming who we can be, the things that stop us believing in ourselves, and actually the voice in our head that tells us we're not good enough to do things. Lisa gives her tips on how to change that, and also some thoughts around, if you're an entrepreneur, what you might need to do in terms of your network of people that can support you. The podcast split into 2 episodes to give you a chance to listen to each in a short time period. So this is episode 1. Episode 2 will be released in the next few weeks. I'd like to apologise up front to all the listeners out there that my voice didn't fully record properly. I hadn't set the microphone levels at the correct setting before we started. But I'm hoping this will not detract from your enjoyment and understanding of the podcast. Please remember to leave us a review and any rating you'd like at the end of it, because obviously this helps us get found by other people who may benefit from the thoughts and inspiration we're putting out. Thank you and enjoy the podcast. So welcome to the Ignium podcast. We are looking at how do we create sparks in your business, sparks in your life, and help you reignite the spark when it might have fizzled out. Today I'm going to be talking to Lisa Lloyd. Lisa's a chartered psychotherapist and psychologist, and her view is she helps businesses get their people right, because when you get people right, you get the business right. So in a nutshell, Lisa, how would you describe what you do? I can give you a brief introduction, but what's the words you use?
Thanks, Bill. So I work with individuals to help them be their best and to thrive, actually often by helping companies know how to support those individuals. That might be around mental health and well-being and that kind of thing, which is a bit more than just the depression and anxiety and what people tend to think about mental health being about. And also a lot of supporting managers to really work out how to keep their people engaged and motivated and productive. And it's, that's whether that's about their own skill and their own knowledge, or it's kind of a collective in terms of everyone embarking on some learning together. And it's, a lot about sort of psychological safety in the workplace, which is really important at the moment, so that people feel, included, what's going on and able to kind of contribute and so on, which is really relevant in what's happening now with all the change going on. Change is another area. So, it's such a changing, diverse kind of workplace environment at the moment in terms of everything's taking slightly different tracks moving forward. And it's how you get people on board with that. I don't just expect everyone to join you where you are in the journey, but recognising where people are at, which can be very different parts of that cycle, and helping them move forward.
I think
and kind of, the emotional stuff that you and I talk a lot about, like emotional intelligence and so on. And really, I think it's a lot of people in this space, but I think for me, it's about really unpicking what's going on, what's actually going on in that business, and what people really think's going on, what they think's going well, what's not going so well. Sort of unpicking and looking at the why, and then you can work out what needs to happen to make that better.
And it's interesting actually, because that why is something that I think is really fundamental. I've just been writing an article at the moment around purpose, and the article is "Why is purpose more important now?" And it relates to the fact that a lot of businesses are struggling with employees, and employees are struggling with their business. And you mentioned that mental health, and looking at how do you best employ people, and how do you employ the best people, and how do you keep and retain them. And I think this word purpose is going to become more prevalent as we go on. And I've written lots of articles in the past, but looking to write something now around why is it now important when we're going to what we're going, and how do employees really connect to that why, which connects to people. Because at the end of the day, the model of the world I look at is the fact that people are the fundamental foundation of every business, wherever you are. And if you build the right talent, capability and culture with the right values, actually it forms the core of any business. And you've got to get that foundation right.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of one of those underlying beliefs that, it's about, we have to have that sense of meaning and purpose. And if we start there, everything else kind of blossoms and it emerges, and we start flowing in the right direction. But people forget to kind of go back to the basics. Yeah, I think that's one of the... They start thinking, like, that's where I want to be, and that's where I'm heading. And they forget to think about, okay, what does everyone really believe we're here for? Why do I get out of bed in the morning? Why do I come to work at this particular organisation? Why am I not working somewhere else? What's my belief and my value in the people here and what we're trying to achieve.
I think that's really key. I was saying to you earlier, I've just been running a workshop this week all around values and beliefs and emotions, and helping people get in touch with literally who they are. And this course that I've been running this week was with sales executives and service managers in a car company. And the key that came out is actually that we want to help people get in touch with who they are at whatever age they are, because I believe that's the fundamental reason we can do things, is because we know who we are and just can communicate differently. And one of the things I think comes out for a lot of people, and we'll use this word now, imposter syndrome, people have a belief about who they are, but also as they gain skills, some people feel that they're not good enough. They're not able to do the job they want to do well enough. So we talked this podcast around this concept of imposter syndrome. I've got a view of what it is in my mind, but I'd love to know what's your view on what imposter syndrome is, and why is that of importance right now?
So a huge number of people experience imposter syndrome at some point, and I think is more prevalent now because roles are changing so much. But I think it's that feeling of inadequacy and self-doubt, almost being a fraud, despite the fact you've had previous success or failure. So it's, you've got the evidence there, but like you were just saying, it's about being aware, actually kind of getting in touch with yourself and actually looking at the fact that I've got this evidence that I am a success, yet I still don't feel like that's justified. I still feel that's real. And people, this whole cycle, you end up fearing failure, and you end up being in a situation where, for some people, it's that need for perfectionism. So often people can be overly critical of themselves. And I think, again, some people have unrealistic expectations of what they are about, or actually inflate a sense of self-importance. So it's that, if I'm not doing my best, then it's all going to completely fail, not really realising the value of the team around them. And I think there's a huge amount of anxiety at the moment because of people being made redundant. Why me? Or my role's changing. Can I do the new role? Or you've been out of the workplace and you've got to get back into the workplace. How am I going to re-enter? I was writing recently about pink collar recession and the sense of women's role, the industries that women work a lot in terms of, retail and the food industry and so on, about which is often casual hours and so on. It's about, so they're the first people to go, or they have often caring responsibilities. So they end up they prioritize their family over work, and therefore they're now beginning perhaps to think about, schools are going back, so I can get back into the workplace, but that's, trying to re-enter a workplace. So you start to self-doubt and so on.
And that's a big thing, actually. And I hadn't thought about that pink collar recession. I'd like to come back to that in a minute. I think the bit you mentioned there earlier about is this perfectionism and fear of failure. I'd just like to touch on that first. So this word imposter syndrome, I don't know when it first originated, but I wonder, you see a lot in the press about people not doing things because they're fearing what might happen. And it could be success or failure, but it stops them in the first place. And I wonder, what is it you see, and what are the patterns you start to see in individuals when you say that's because of imposter syndrome? And maybe that's labeling it in the wrong way, but what's the things you look for to say this is what we need to deal with and tackle?
Yeah, it's really interesting on the label, because I tend to try and avoid labels as much as possible, because I think as soon as someone's kind of given a label, then everyone shuts down the big picture and stops valuing them as an individual and looking at the evidence actually contrary to the label. They just start pigeonholing them. I think it's that sense of someone consistently saying that they feel that they're fearing being judged, they're feeling being shown up, they're feeling that if they put themselves in the spotlight, are they going to be good enough? And it's detecting that constant questioning, or that something that's coming across is about self-doubt. It's about that sense of fear of being embarrassed or shamed or being criticized, or which might not be very obvious, and people often don't use those words because people don't like to admit that they experience imposter syndrome. It's something people feel embarrassed about having, And they
Yeah.
want
Yeah.
to, people like to be thought of as being confident and capable.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so they don't want to have to put their hand up and say, oh, actually, I don't feel confident enough to do this.
Yeah.
Because people feel that's a real kind of, that's, that means that in itself means I'm not good enough. The fact I don't feel good enough.
And it's interesting, you mentioned about the pink collar recession. I wonder, do you see the symptoms of imposter syndrome more in men or in women, or does it not matter? Is it irrelevant?
I think that's a really good question. I think for typically women are people will talk about women as in terms of difference, emotional intelligence, and so on. And so women will perhaps question themselves more, they'll doubt themselves more if they're around. There's lots and lots of evidence if they're in a very male heavy meeting or something. Actually, do they feel the confidence to speak up? Do they feel that their views will be listened to and valued as much as others? So there's that. But I also think on the flip side of that, lots of men will be have this illusion that they're supposed to be in control and everything, and they don't necessarily like to ask for help.
I can relate to that.
It's a double-edged sword in the sense of some people generally feeling it, but perhaps being okay about asking for help from other women and saying they don't feel as confident as they should.
Yeah.
And men perhaps give the illusion that actually they're super confident.
Yeah.
But underneath they're perhaps not. And I think that's the harder group in a sense, than to get them to break down these barriers and ask for help and access help, to kind of, admit they're not a superhuman who knows everything and who can do everything all the time, and that actually it's okay. And it shows quite a character of, strength and so on. If you're able to say, I don't feel great about this right now. I'm not sure.
There's almost a sense of, we often talked about, people having to be needing to be vulnerable to be out there and actually express who they are.
Yes.
And when we look at the work of Brené Brown and other people talking about, the power of vulnerability.
Yeah.
Part of that to me is around people not, a lot of the problem to say is the fact that people don't feel they can do that because they're in an environment where they've worked up through an organization, or they're running their own business. And actually for them to suddenly say, I don't know where I'm going, actually it's quite difficult for them. And you mentioned about the illusion of control, because they want to give this illusion of control. And it's almost like the swan above the water, totally graceful, but underwater it's frantically paddling.
Yes.
And I wonder whether in this last few months where we've had pandemic and people have been locked down and businesses have been working differently, are we seeing more people putting their hand up and saying, I need help? Or are we seeing less because they're not open and not able to go and talk to people about it? I wonder, what's your impression of that?
I don't know if it's more or less. I think it's perhaps more. I don't know if the numbers have changed, but I think there might be a clearer distinction between those two groups.
Yeah. Okay.
So there might be more people now. You're becoming aware of more people saying, actually, I'm not really sure, and I want some help to move forward with this. Whereas those people before might have been open for help, but not necessarily shouting so loudly and trying to make that happen. But the numbers thing is an interesting question. I'm not sure, but I think people are having to think about it now. So in terms of where they're going, rather than just drifting along, people are actually having to think, okay, where am I going and what am I doing? And actually being conscious of their actions. And then perhaps that starts to highlight their emotional response to those actions.
Yeah. And just going back slightly, actually, one of the things you mentioned just now about people's fear of being judged or people's feeling of not being good enough. So when you're talking about people taking an action, actually, if they're fearful of being judged, I wonder, does that stop them taking certain action for themselves? Is that the issue that we start seeing, that people just don't do things?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, that links with the whole, this is all about anxiety.
Okay.
And anxiety, I always, I talk a lot with people about anxiety, and I think it's almost having this inner voice. It's like a negative dialogue. And it's like your inner critic. And I always encourage people to give it an identity, because as soon as you become aware of that inner voice and it's starting to tell you, you don't do this and don't do that, people forget that they have a choice of whether they listen to it or not. So if people just listen to it, and they, as a lot of people do, they give into it, then they end up, they don't do anything. They stop putting themselves in positions of doing things they want to do, because it's a voice saying, no, don't do that, because what if?
Yeah. And that's very damaging, isn't it? So there's a lot of people probably not fulfilling their full potential. Going back to what you said at the beginning, you help people fulfill their potential, and you help, if you get people right, you get businesses right.
Yeah.
There's a lot here around, unless people recognize the things they're doing or that voice in their head.
Yeah.
If they hear it and choose to go with it and say, I can't do this because I'm not good enough, actually they're never going to reach their full potential.
Exactly.
And they hold themselves back.
Yeah, it's a real self-fulfilling prophecy, because the more you hold back, I always liken this kind of like inner critic to being a bit of a bully, and the more you feed a bully, the bigger they get. And it ends up kind of, where people start to have just a few self-doubts and feel a bit anxious on a couple of occasions.
Yeah.
They're not aware of that, or the people around them are not aware of that and how to support them. Then it can get to a point where it grows more and more and becomes then quite overpowering, because you've given into that bully too many times. The bully now actually only has to suggest, oh, what if? And you end up thinking, oh my gosh, I can't possibly have a go at that. I might fail.
Wow. So there's an interesting here. We talk about, obviously at this stage, August 2020, where the pandemic's still going on, and a lot of businesses now are coming into the third quarter of the year. Businesses are making decisions, and we're seeing a lot of redundancy. So a lot of people are going to be hit really hard.
Yeah.
And you mentioned about pink collar recession. So tell me about that in terms of people's inner voice, and if you've been made redundant, what's the typical things that show up for people then?
Same sort of thing in terms of just that worry about how to break back into the workplace, in terms of you've been off because either you made redundant or you had to prioritize caring responsibility or whatever it was.
Yeah.
That whole sense of trying to break back into the job market is when people start to say, well, what is it I'm good at? What is it I can do? And I'm now up against all these hundreds of thousands of other people all trying to get back in. So why is someone going to employ me rather than that person? And you start to question. And I think the way our brain works, our imagination will always, if our anxiety is high and our emotional arousal is higher than it should be, it closes down our thinking, and it ends up being kind of very black and white. And our imagination tends to look at the worst side of things. So there's always the glass half empty rather than the glass being half full. And so that's when you start to question, well, why is someone going to choose me rather than, of course, they're going to choose me?
Yeah. And interesting, actually, even just watching your face then when you said that, actually, there's a big physiological impact on people there. If you've got that negative voice saying, why are they going to choose me? Actually, you're almost going to knock yourself down straight away. But as soon as and it's almost trying to get yourself out there and say, they will choose me. But there's a thing you mentioned earlier about choice, because you and I can talk about this, and we know that we have a choice because we've done a lot of research on it. But for someone being impacted by this at the moment, or reaching a point in their career where they're now thinking, am I good enough? Am I really this good? And what do people need to do to create that awareness themselves so that they can question the voice and say, no, this isn't right, do something different? What's the techniques they maybe need to use?
Well, I often get people to start looking at their past successes and their, what's the evidence of actually their success, and what would, and of them thinking for themselves about that, but also asking them, what would other people say about you? What are the positive things? And that's a really lovely question, because when you ask someone themselves, as we are as humans, we don't like to gloat. We don't like to say, I'm great at. But if you say, well, what would your colleague or what would your boss or what would your partner or your children or whoever say about you? Positive things. What are the top 3 things that they say that's really good about you? You then begin to actually access the individual's true beliefs, true constructs about themselves. And it's a really good way of actually helping an individual identify those, and then you can start to build on that and help them identify what are your other strengths, which are nothing to do with what we deem as success or achievement. What are your successes and your talents? What are you good at? What sort of contribution do you make? And it's kind of about helping people identify the positive side of what they're about. And then reminding them, okay, when you hear this little voice, and I was talking to someone yesterday, they call theirs Brenda, but I actually have lots of Bobs, Bills, Brendas. I don't know what's all of the B's, but when they hear this Brenda talking, it's like, well, are you going to listen to her telling you can't do it, or are you going to remember? You might picture like a wise owl sitting on your shoulder, or some people in the past have said that they picture me being just behind them, kind of saying, "Come on, this is what you're really like," and then you're in that position where you actually have a choice.
Wow. And so there's a couple of things there in terms of just recapping what you're saying is helping people recapture the past successes and look for the evidence specifically of where they've been successful, but not just looking at their strengths, looking at their talents, looking at their contributions, but looking at the positive elements of their life. So looking in an all-round holistic way at who they are was one of the bits I took out. And the other bit, I love that about giving it a voice. Giving it a name, So you've got the voice, but actually calling it something, and almost making sure they can see what that voice is saying to them. From an NLP perspective, if we're looking at how to help people develop, we'll give it a voice, but we'll also then, if it's a voice which is a critic, ask them to give a Mickey Mouse sound to it, or speed it up, make it sound really funny, so you can then laugh at it and then shrink it away into the distance. So some of what you're doing there is actually helping them name it, recognize it, but also layer on top of it the positives that they've got as a person as well, so they then can start outweighing the negatives with that positive voice.
Exactly. And I think when people have started to kind of put that information together, and they kind of be a bit more self-aware, it's really powerful for people to be able to visualize themselves being in a situation where they are standing up to their inner critic. Because typically what happens is people don't really think about it, don't practice. And then they get to that moment of being on the spot and being, expected to do something that they feel uncomfortable about, or being, having to put themselves in a situation of fulfilling a role and they're feeling anxious. And at that point, as soon as you start to feel anxious, again, your emotional arousal is up, and it really impacts on how you're behaving and what you're thinking. But when you're really calm during whatever point during the day, you can just take a moment to kind of close your eyes and imagine, okay, I can hear my critic, Brenda, and I'm now going to say to her, buzz off. And actually, yesterday we were talking about, imagine, she's been a bit bossy. So the person speaking to yesterday was imagining putting on her own bossy boots, and she actually pictured what colour they were and what they felt like, whether they were lined or had buckles or whatever. And she actually wanted to squish Brenda. So she imagined Brenda, who actually is obviously quite small because she's in your brain, trying to be quite bossy. And then my client stood on her, squished her, which for her was really powerful. She's like, actually, I'm not going to listen to you anymore. I know this is what's true about me.
What a lovely thought. And what I love of that is giving them the power to do it, and almost empowering them to take charge of that voice, as opposed to letting the voice run them. It's them saying, I'm not listening to you anymore. I'm not standing for this. And the analogy I've just drawn when you mentioned just now is, if you feed a bully, it gets bigger, is what you said.
Yes.
But actually what you're now doing is standing up to the bully.
Exactly.
Stopping it and then squashing it down.
Exactly.
That's powerful. That's really powerful.
Yeah.
And obviously we're seeing a lot more of this. You're seeing people come to you because they need support. So at least they recognize it. And I always say, at the end of the day, awareness is the greatest agent for change. So once you become aware, you can then do something about it. So what about for these people who haven't yet become aware? They're struggling. What do they need to do to generate that awareness?
So I think often that's about people around. So that's the other part of working with organisations, to help everyone have a sense of awareness around what anxiety looks like, and what we can do. We can recognise when we recognise these signs. So, for example, lots of organisations have mental health first aiders.
Yes.
But those mental health first aiders, which are great, but they might have been trained. I had an organisation contact me last week. He said, we've got 50 or so of them trained, and that was brilliant. They were trained a couple of years ago, but actually because things like imposter syndrome and lots of other issues are now really on the rise, they're not feeling confident about recognising it or then dealing with it. So it's almost like CPD for them. So we were talking about how to put together some training, some support, which we're now putting into place where, I will be talking with them about, okay, these are the signs you're looking out for, and then this is what you can do about it. So once we begin to identify the language that people are using, such as, I'm not sure, but what if, and that sense of, it might not be good enough, or I'm not sure because so-and-so is going to be there, or whatever. You start to identify the language, you can then work out what you need to do in response, which might be something saying, it doesn't sound like you're feeling particularly confident about that, or it sounds like that particular person's worrying you, or that particular situation is worrying you. Is that something worth talking about a little bit more? Because then as soon as you start having that dialogue in a very friendly, human, engaging way, which is not about turn to page 42 of my handbook and this is my structured response, but just to say, look, this sounds like it's a bit of a block for you. What can we do? And let's look at, actually, I've seen you plenty of times with that person and you've been absolutely brilliant. And these are the outcomes. Or you've been, in meetings like this, in these particular examples, and you've been brilliant.
It's interesting because there's two thoughts going through my head. I've been running my own business for 15 years now. So we don't have a mental first aider in my business.
Yeah.
It's me having to do that.
Yeah.
And I wonder, when you've got a smaller business or a smaller business owner or an entrepreneur who's setting up business, we often look at entrepreneurs as being, they've got the power, they've got the talent, they've got the drive, they're creative, they're innovative, they go do these things. Does it ever show up for those type of people?
Yeah, well, you see, it's really interesting. So I was talking to someone recently about something called high functioning anxiety, which is a really interesting term, where you have these kind of high flyers who seem to be so incredibly competent and confident and juggling 100 balls at any one time and not ever dropping them. And it's very easy to look at them. And I think this is what I often do with people who are experiencing imposter syndrome, and say, well, okay, this is an illusion. This is what we are seeing. But underneath, actually, there's a sense of panic. And I think for people who appear to be kind of high functioning, high achieving and very successful, behind closed doors and actually underneath, there's that, that level of emotional arousal is actually often higher as a norm than it should be. Okay. And that impacts on their ability to sleep well, and it impacts on their mood and their irritability and, their ability to empathize and all those kinds of things, but that just becomes part of who they are in the day to day. They don't even recognize it as anxiety because it's just who they are. They're just these kind of people who are constantly on the go and just doing these amazing things.
Yeah. And that must be the biggest issue, isn't it? Because, big businesses are looking out for this now, and people are much more aware of mental health. But in a small business or an entrepreneurial business where you've got a team of people around you, maybe you've got 50 people working in your team, it's very hard for you to admit you've got a problem, or even sometimes recognize what you've got is a problem in the first place.
Yes.
But we know that long term, I look at the models I look at from a business from the point of view of going through the number of growth cycles, and at some stage hitting a wall. And when that brick wall comes, actually business owners and entrepreneurs hit it hard.
Yes.
And the issue is that hitting that wall is stress, anxiety, frustration. And it turns into some form of dis-ease, which typically comes out as heart attack, high blood pressure, divorce, all these other things that come around. And unless they recognize it early enough, they're going to hit the wall. So what do people need to do to put the hand up and say, I've got a problem?
To find someone who they can be themselves with. So it's really important, because, when you can kind of, I always talk about on my hands, I've got 5. If I had to think about 5 people, I could think of someone I could just go and have loads of fun with, and someone who'd be up for a real good challenge if we're doing something outdoorsy, and someone who would actually listen and really get, and they wouldn't judge and so on. And it's about everyone needs someone they can be complete themselves with, and be very authentic and say, actually, what I'm really struggling right now, and this because, and without that person then saying, no, don't be daft, of course you're great, but someone who's actually prepared just to listen and not necessarily solve the problem, but just to listen, because as soon as you start having the dialogue is when things start to shift. And I think for the people supporting those individuals, talking about entrepreneurs and so on, it's great. It's often, I've had so many calls where people are like, oh, you're so amazing, and what you're doing is so fantastic, and so on. And actually, we tend to focus on the outcomes a lot, rather than saying, gosh, that sounds like it must be quite hard. That's got to be quite challenging. There must be points where you're like feeling, have I bitten off more than I can chew? And, I was speaking to someone, you can have my friend, my friend Bill or whatever. I was speaking to so-and-so recently, and he was saying that actually, yeah, he's achieved something similar, but actually you get to moments of just feeling completely burnt out, completely overwhelmed. Yeah. And as soon as you start introducing that almost gives permission for that person to say, yeah, you know what, actually, you're right. It's so, I get to a Friday night or a Saturday night and I'm just on my knees and I can't cope. And but you have, it's almost giving them, it's opening the door for them to be able to say, I feel okay, it's safe enough for me to be able to express myself honestly.
And it's interesting because that thing about opening the door for them, I think, is key, isn't it? Because, having the door open to them and saying, look, it's okay to talk to people. There's two thoughts going through my head there is, most people who are senior in a business, or most people as entrepreneurs, often they'll turn to their wife or partner or husband to talk. But it's a real big issue, isn't it, when you're then admitting you've got a weakness? Because sometimes you've got to be seen as the person who's carrying the family, carrying the person around. And you don't want to turn around to your significant partner and say, look, I'm having a problem. So some people are probably lack that individual to talk to, which is the first point I made. And then just leading on from that is giving them the awareness to say, look, you can talk to me about these things without feeling judged.
Yes. And that's where it comes to the whole, whether it's part of your family, is your family a family who's communicative? Or do you have friends who are genuinely people who ask each other? Or are you just kind of, when I speak to my husband, he goes and meets up with some of his mates and I'll be asking, how's so-and-so? It's like, I don't know, we didn't really talk about how we actually felt about stuff. It's like, we're talking about someone's got a new car or whatever. It's that, it's finding that person. I know that's what, a lot of organisations have worked really hard around this, and they have, as I said, mental health first aiders, or they have people who are those people whose responsibility, they've almost been given the job title of, your job is to make sure, to look after people's well-being and mental health. But if those people are not just going around having genuinely authentic conversations, there's no good having a badge saying, I'm the person you can come and talk to if you've got a problem. If you haven't got a culture where people are able to be open and honest and transparent and say, I'm so excited about this week, but I'm actually really anxious about that. Or I'm really proud of this about myself, but actually I'm struggling with that bit of it. And and that's got to be from the top down. You've got to have the people at the top, the leaders and the managers saying, these are the things I'm really pleased about, these things I'm worried about, and actually modeling that so that people know that they can be honest and open without it affecting the promotion opportunities or whatever.
And I think that's the biggest issue, isn't it?
Yeah.
So in days gone by, which isn't that long ago, people felt they couldn't talk about that because they had to be seen to be perfect.
Yes.
And if they showed any chink in their armor, they worried about what the impact would be long term. They would be looked over for promotion, for instance.
Yeah.
So do we talk a good game about mental health when it comes to imposter syndrome, or do we actually do what we're talking about? Does that make sense? Are we just talking about it and it's all right, you can tell me what's really going on, but actually no, I'm writing a note of it saying actually this person's not really good enough because they've not got the functioning ability to get to the top of this business.
Yeah. And that's a really good question. I think that's the question, isn't it? And I think the answer depends on where you work.
Yeah.
It's so dependent on the particular organisation you're in.
Yeah.
And if you are in an organisation where you can speak up and can be authentic and say, I'm worried about or I'm struggling with, and actually you're supported through that as a part of recognising you're a human being. If you're supported through that, then actually people overcome those blips quite quickly and can move on and then become stronger people, become more resilient because they've worked out how to overcome something that's been a bit challenging.
Yeah.
If you're too afraid to be open and honest, and you therefore have to hide it because you're fearful of the consequences otherwise, you can't be your true self. You're never going to learn to be more resilient. You can't function at your best because you're always going to have these negatives, these anxieties, these worries kind of you're holding on to, thinking I'm but I'm not sure about, or I'm worried about, and you can't express it. And in the good old days, I would have said, well, leave that job and go work for a different company. Depends, because there's such a shortage of jobs.
It's hard to do.
If you've got the ability to choose, when I was, talking to people about those who've been out of the job market coming back in, start with your ideal don't just go to any old company. Start with your ideal company, those that have a proven track record of actually having that kind of culture where people can be themselves, and is recognizing that speaking up is actually a strength of character. It is not a weakness.
That's I think a really key point, isn't it? And I think this links in. You talked about you need the culture of openness. So the model I use for growing business is actually we build it on the foundation of culture and talent. And culture, if you create that culture of openness and feeling that we all can talk about things and we're open with emotions and we recognize people as humans, not just machines which we put an input and get an output, and then we can really make people feel comfortable talking about themselves. And when I look at the model I often have in terms of your comfort zone, in terms of a lot of people sit in the center of their comfort zone and look at what they can influence and say, well, that's all I can influence, I'll sit within that. But often the things outside of our comfort zone which stretch us are the things that give us the power to deal with them in the future. And in a business, if we're only stuck in our comfort zone because we're feeling like we can't talk about how we really feel, we're never going to stretch ourselves to that next level, and we're never going to grow. So actually the culture is just going to degrade itself over time, because it's going to be a culture of fear, because I'm just fearful for not saying things.
Exactly. And you think that the kind of, it's quite a common theme that people who become really great in their workplace, who have consciously made that decision to kind of climb the ladder, are people who have said, right, I just need to surround myself with people who are better than me, who are higher up, who are more knowledgeable or more skillful at these particular things. And I'm going to spend a lot of time observing and listening and learning from them. And then I'm going to then be putting into practice, having a go at doing what they're doing, because I know that's what's the key to the next level up. And it's about, but that's a part of that is that knowledge, it's that self-awareness of there are people better than me and I need to learn from them rather than being threatened by them. And I've got to have a go at doing that, because if I don't have a go at doing it, that's what I need to be able to do. So I'm going to have a go. But again, that comes back to being able to do it in a safe way. So starting off small, it's kind of thinking, I've never done public speaking before. So you wouldn't go and stand in front of an audience of several hundred people. You would think, okay, I haven't spoken in front of a group of 10 people or whatever. Or it might be in my team meeting. I don't ever speak up. So the next time I'm just going to make sure I contribute something voluntarily. That's going to be my starting point. And as soon as you do that, you start to build up the evidence that you can speak up and be heard and your opinion was valued and so on.
I think that's a great thing, actually. And I think that links into a lot of people who are working at home at the moment have been doing so for the last few months in terms of getting their message out. I believe most people have become more comfortable talking to each other through video conferencing. Because we've had to do it. We've been thrust into doing it there. And your point there about starting small with public speaking, I think is a key one. So a lot of business owners I come across, they want to promote themselves, they want to promote their business, but sometimes they either don't know how, or they're too afraid to go and ask for that help. But the key point I'm taking from you there is actually find the help and actually look at how you can start in a small way doing something. So whether it's marketing, whether it's writing a blog, whether it's writing a LinkedIn post, whether it's doing a video. Just start small.
And expecting mistakes. So knowing, not expecting perfectionism, because you're not, if you're on a role where you're trying to develop yourself and you're in this pathway to, you are moving, you're not just staying still in this comfort zone, you are moving in a new direction, whatever that looks like, and for whatever reason, but you are moving, you are going to have to expect to make mistakes. Like someone learning to ride a bike, you expect to fall off a few times. And I think it's about helping people focus on, when they make that mistake, the fact that that's a learning opportunity. So, okay, why did that happen? What can you learn from that so that that's less likely to happen next time? Rather than, oh my gosh, I failed, I can't do this. And I think but that takes a lot of self-awareness. And, even I remember doing a webinar at the start of lockdown, and I ended up talking about some stats or something. And then my mind got sidetracked on something else that was relevant, because I tend to think I'm going to talk about this, and my mind goes off and went in all different directions. And I can talk about that and that and that. And I ended up fumbling and stumbling over a statistic. And then it kind of, and then afterwards, and I think it's in the feedback, someone said something about, you need to know your stats if you're talking about stats. And it's one statistic I kind of stumbled over. And I was thinking, my gosh, I'm really rubbish at this. I can't do this, because actually, what if I don't say the right thing? And I was thinking afterwards, actually, get a grip. Yes, that bit, if I could erase something, I'd erase that kind of 20 seconds. But actually, the rest of it was useful, what I was talking about, and it was helping people understand something a bit differently. And so, but people tend to fixate on the mistakes, rather than going, okay, it happened, and we can just forget about it because only a certain amount of people saw it or heard it, or actually, I would expect people to make mistakes, like being on a video call and having your pet coming in or your child coming in. People expect it when you and we tend to forget that.
And I think that's a really interesting point, isn't it? This fixation on mistakes, because I think a lot of that is our psychology from being younger, being at school, being in being told off by someone, being made to feel stupid because we made a mistake. And as adults, the bit that I talk to people about as a coach is actually, if you were to go back and tell your 6-year-old self, when you were told off by that teacher for making that mistake in that maths test, what would you tell them now? And you would say, actually, do you know what? It doesn't matter. Or from a coaching perspective, if someone pulls you up on the statistic, is that about them or about you? And a lot of people get this thinking, oh, it's all about me, but actually it's not. It's about the other person. It's their issue that they're dealing with. And we just need to be sympathetic. Yes, I made a mistake. It was just a mistake of statistics. It's not a slur on me. It's just a thing I did at that time. It's not me as my personality.
I was being interviewed for 2 weeks ago for a magazine article about it's actually about women's brains and what happens in midlife and so on, and about why suddenly you get to the point of thinking, I don't care in the way that we had once cared. And I was talking about when I was in France a few weeks ago, and the fact that I'd been watching teenage boys throwing themselves in somersaults off this really high ledge into a lake. And I looked at them and I was like, and I love outdoor pursuits and stuff, so just jumping normally off this really high ledge wouldn't have been a buzz for me. Other people can't. My husband and children, actually my husband was gripping on, my children were kind of sliding off the edge. But I was thinking, I can do a forward somersault. And you're standing up there actually feels quite scary. And I'm looking down thinking, I've never in my life tried to do a forward somersault of anything. And I know I'm going to make a complete idiot of myself, which I did. And it hurt lots because I landed on the water really badly and so on. And everyone was laughing. But actually, I didn't care. And I carried on practicing until by the end of our holiday, I could do it as it resembled a somersault. It's that sense of actually, I'm expecting it to go really badly. I'm expecting it not to feel very comfortable and to look ridiculous. And my children were rolling around laughing. But actually, it was good fun. And I had a real sense of achievement from having done it and got a bit better at it.
I think that's brilliant. And I think that I was reading a quote this morning, actually, in an article, which I will find later on. And it talked about exactly that type of principle, in the sense that people are laughing, but they're not the ones doing it. It's easy to stand on the sidelines and be the critic, be the judge, and say, well, what are they doing wrong? But actually, it's when you're in the arena doing it for yourself that it matters. And actually, it's your own sense to say, do you know what? I went and did that. And challenge yourself and say, I'm not the 6-year-old Lisa who wouldn't do these things anymore. It doesn't matter anymore. I'm going to go and do it. And if we could go back in time and change that thought process when we were growing up in 16, 17, 18, 19-year-olds and do things differently, I think this imposter syndrome, which comes out in the same way, I'm not good enough. How can I do this? Am I going to make a fool? Are people going to laugh? Actually, it just doesn't matter. But we don't do that young enough.
It's almost like that fake it till you make it. It's that whole that ability to smile and think about your posture and think about how you dress and what you're just everything about you, just kind of giving off the sense that I am feeling confident and I am feeling relaxed, and knowing that, if I smile, because the way mirror neurons work, people around me are much more likely to smile. And then when I see people smiling, I'm going to feel more relaxed. And just knowing, kind of being aware of almost putting yourself in a situation where you are feeling more confident than you actually are inside. Music, anything that pattern matches back to, situations where you felt on top of the world. So if you have particular music that really kind of makes you feel full of energy and you can conquer anything, then listen to that, put yourself in that frame of mind, and then go and do whatever it is you want to do. It's kind of creating that sense of, okay, I'm pretending this is okay. Inside it doesn't feel okay, but it's you're giving yourself the evidence that you can do it. Because as soon as you've done it, you're like, oh wow, I did it, and that felt great. And then that's the evidence to start challenging that inner critic.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that's, we're just about to come to an end of your time in that sense. But I think that if I was just to recap on those tips, I think there's some really powerful things there around this: fake it till you make it. And what is it you need to do to feel confident, to feel relaxed, to feel calm?
Mm-hmm.
And that piece you talked about, mirror neurons. I'd love to come back and talk to you about that another day, in terms of, if you smile, others smile around you.
Yeah.
If you walk into the supermarket looking glum, you're going to find lots of other glum people. If you walk in looking happy, you're going to find the happy people. It's the RAS working in that sense.
Yeah.
But actually, we can trick ourselves into feeling confident. And you mentioned about, put the piece of music on, stand in the power pose. And what's the Amy Cuddy move of standing in a power pose and faking it like that?
Yeah.
Actually, we can create that. And you mentioned about give yourself a sense of evidence you need to prove that you're actually confident in that moment.
Yes.
I think that sounds a great few tips. Is there anything else you'd add to that? What else would we need to do if we wanted to?
I always think forward wind and think, how do you like to be remembered? So do you want to be, will people be saying, gosh, they were so good because they, achieved this particular client deal and they were so successful with that? Or do you want people to look back and go, yeah, actually this person was incredibly caring and they were really good listening and they were very hard working, whatever, they were willing to take risks and really willing to have a go at new things. And, think it's going back to what we were talking about right at the start, about what your values are in terms of what is actually really important to me.
Yeah.
And is it about the success, however you define that other people will be measuring you against?
Yeah.
Or actually is my idea of real success and real achievement something much more about, the things that I'm emotionally attached to, such as friends, family, my strengths, my talents, what I contribute to the world, all those kinds of things, which are not necessarily about how much money or how big a deal you secured or whatever.
Yeah, I love that. And I often give to my clients at the beginning of our journey a wheel to fill in, to ask them where they rank themselves. And one of those is wealth. And of course, people always think of wealth as being money. Yeah. But as you've just said, that is not about that. Wealth is actually an abundance of other things. Yes. We just happen to make it sound like money at the moment because that's how we typically measure people.
Yes.
But actually, we measure ourselves on actually all those happiness indicators. I was talking to a man the other day who I'm coaching who's over 50 now. And he said, in his view, what he realized when he got to 50 is actually life was about experiences. Yeah. And for him, he just now wanted to go and collect experiences. He didn't need a new patio or a new car anymore. Yeah. He just wanted experiences with his wife and his family to give him that sense of happiness and build his own wealth for the future.
Happiness gives you the advantage. So Sean Aker says that, when you're happy, you can have as much as a 31% improvement in terms of your brain's performance than if you're in a neutral or an unhappy state. And sometimes I do an experiment with people where, I'm creating a sense of anxiety. I deliberately provoke it. And then ask them to do a simple exercise, and everyone's in panic mode and can't do it. Yeah. And then I get everyone to relax, and I get them to smile and do all the things we talk about in terms of posture and so on, and then to do that activity, and they all perform really, really well. Wow. So the happiness bit is so, so important.
Oh, wow, that's lovely. I love that. And actually, to me, that's this word priming. I can prime myself for success by doing those things and getting myself into the state I need to be.
Yeah.
And to me, I talk about state around, getting your physiology right and actually having that internal dialogue and then looking at the picture you want in the future. Create those three things. Say, where do I want to be in the future? And actually, you can change your state instantly, but you have to make a choice around doing that. And I love that. And I love the fact you've got some numbers there, statistics around 31% increase straight away just by feeling happy.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow. Well, Lisa, this has been fascinating again, and there's lots more we could talk about there. One final question for you in that case before we hang up.
Yes.
And this is something I'm learning from other podcasts at the moment, in terms of what's the podcast you've been listening to, what's the books you've been reading that have given you some way forward, or some happiness, or some leverage in your life at this moment.
So the podcast, actually, I came across quite recently because someone else put me onto it. Is Jason Fox Wild Tales podcast,
Okay.
which is about adventure, challenges, resilience, and how humans interact. And he interviews incredible people. So Ross Edgley, who swam around the UK solo, Victoria Pendleton, and just these amazing people who have achieved amazing things. And I love outdoor adventure. So for me, it's just so fascinating. But they relate the whole thing to how you overcome challenges and how you keep yourself going and that resilience and so on. So I think I love that. I always get a lot from that.
Love that one. Yeah.
Some amazing people talk. In terms of books, one I read probably last year, but I keep coming back to The 9 Lies About Work.
The 9 Lies About Work. Okay.
9 Lies About Work by Marcus Buckingham and Ashley Goodall.
Okay.
And I love that. It's about a leader's guide to the real world. And it's that this is the real world. This is not your textbook stuff. This is not how we did things 20 years ago. You know, it challenges everything we know and think because we've inherited it. You know, how we do appraisals or whatever. I mean, literally looks at every aspect of what we do in business and turns it on its head. So I really, really love that.
Wow.
And the other one was The Power of Perception by Shawn Andrews. And she is an American, very, very wise American who talks a lot about it's our perception. It's about, in terms of leadership, linked with emotional intelligence, with a gender focus. So for me, it's really fascinating because it links, you know, everything I like about leadership and emotional intelligence and workplace culture and so on. But it actually looks at the perception of gender and how that impacts on people's roots and outcomes.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I love that. And there's two things I would say there on those two. Marcus Buckingham, in his book First Break of All the Rules, I think was a great book, you know, just to challenge our reality. So when you look at 9 Lies About Work, you need to go and have a look at that. And the second one on Power of Perception. I love that in terms of that piece around gender and our perception of who we are. There's a famous experiment which I've been reading about recently, which is looking at Asian American women. And when they were asked to score themselves on a mock SAT test, they did a bit of an experiment. And on some of the tests, they asked them to put their ethnicity. On others, they asked them to put their gender. And because they're Asian Americans, they were typically supposed to, in perception of people, be good at maths and science. But when they scored themselves called themselves women, they scored 21% less than when they scored themselves referencing themselves against their ethnicity.
Wow.
Amazing how just being called a woman related to that power.
Yeah, that sort of insight is really, really powerful. And I think that's what Shawn Andrews does incredibly well in terms of she, you know, this is her world. And she spends all her time researching and all the data and all the massive companies that we all know about. And you listen to the stats and you're like, wow. And it's the learning you can take from that about actually what are we doing? What am I doing with my colleagues? What am I doing for myself? What am I doing within my business that is falling into the traps that we could easily overcome?
Wow, that's powerful. Well, really useful. Thank you. Lisa, thank you. It's lovely and privileged to talk to you yet again. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for your time. I look forward to doing it again in the near future.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Phil.
Thanks. So that concludes this episode of Sparks. Thanks for listening. We're always looking for ideas on how to drive this podcast forward. So if you've got comments, please leave them via a review of our show, along with your rating. Or send us an email to sparks@avmconsult.com.